The strange hoax that complicated Nancy Guthrie's case. There is a moment in almost every major kidnapping investigation where the picture suddenly gets harder to read. Not because the evidence disappears. Not because investigators stop working. But because something enters the case from the outside, something that looks on the surface like a breakthrough, and for a window of time nobody knows whether it is real. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that moment came on February 4, 2026. 3 days after an 84-year-old woman vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona. 3 days after her daughter, NBC's Savannah Guthrie, appeared on camera and pleaded publicly for her mother's safe return. That plea went out to millions of people. And then the family received text messages. Messages that claimed to be from whoever was holding Nancy. Messages that demanded Bitcoin. For investigators already managing blood evidence, a masked suspect captured on doorbell camera footage, and a cascade of incoming tips, those texts represented something that could not be ignored. In an active kidnapping case, you do not ignore ransom contact. You cannot. Every communication that might come from the person holding the victim gets treated as potentially real until proven otherwise. Here is what was proven within approximately 24 hours. Those texts were not from the real abductor. They came from a 42-year-old man named Derek Colella, living in Hawthorne, California. He had no confirmed connection to Nancy Guthrie. No confirmed connection to Tucson. No confirmed connection to the crime itself. He was arrested by the FBI on February 5, 2026, one day after the texts were sent, and charged in federal court with transmitting a false ransom demand and telephonic harassment. When investigators asked him why he sent the texts, he told them he wanted to see if the family would respond. He is currently awaiting trial, scheduled for June 23, 2026. He is presumed innocent of the charges against him. His case is entirely separate from the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. But here is the question this video is going to examine carefully. When false ransom demands enter an active kidnapping investigation on day 3, at the precise moment the investigation is most resource-intensive, most time-sensitive, and most dependent on clear information. What does that cost? Not in a dramatic sense. Not as a theory about what could have happened. But analytically. Practically. In terms of what investigators were managing, what resources were deployed, and what the information environment around this case looked like during one of its most critical windows. This is not a video about who took Nancy Guthrie. Law enforcement is investigating that, and no arrests have been made in the underlying case. This is a video about something that sits alongside that investigation. A strange, documented event that most coverage treated as a footnote, resolved quickly, filed away, moving on. The argument here is that it deserves more than a footnote. Because understanding what false information costs a real investigation is not just relevant to this case. It is relevant to how we think about major criminal cases, public appeals, and the space between what helps an investigation and what quietly complicates it. Stay with me. Because the details matter here, and they are more layered than most coverage suggested. This is The Last Case Records. Subscribe for evidence-based true crime analysis. Let me tell you what most coverage did with the Colella story. A brief report. An arrest announcement. A note that federal charges had been filed. And then the dominant frame. This is a separate matter, unrelated to the actual disappearance, resolved quickly by the FBI. That framing is not wrong. Derek Colella is not charged with taking Nancy Guthrie. The federal case against him concerns 2 text messages. The investigation into the actual abduction continues separately and independently. But there is a difference between something being legally separate and something being practically isolated. And the Colella situation was not practically isolated. It happened inside a real investigation during a real window of time, while real investigators were managing real evidence, and it demanded a real response. To understand why that matters, you need to understand what was happening on February 4, 2026, when those texts arrived. Let's walk through it. Nancy Guthrie had been missing for 3 days. She was reported missing on February 1st, after she failed to appear at her morning church service, a detail confirmed in official reporting. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, had dropped her off at her home the previous evening, January 31st, around 9:50 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie. By February 1st, investigators had already begun examining the scene. By February 5th, one day after the Colella texts arrived, the Pima County Sheriff's Office announced publicly that Nancy Guthrie's blood had been found on her porch. DNA testing had confirmed the match. That announcement came on February 5th. The blood was found and processed before then, which means that during the period when the Colella texts arrived, February 4th, investigators were simultaneously managing physical blood evidence that had confirmed foul play, a doorbell camera footage recovery that had captured a masked, armed individual at Nancy's home, footage that would not be publicly released until February 10th, but which investigators were already analyzing internally, an active tip intake process that would eventually exceed 1,500 confirmed tips, a parallel stream of authentic ransom communications from an unknown source that referenced specific deadlines of February 9th and February 13th. And the FBI had just issued a $50,000 reward, drawing national attention and accelerating the public information flow. Into that environment, on day 3 of an investigation at peak operational intensity, 2 text messages arrived claiming to be from the kidnapper, and investigators had to treat them seriously. This is not speculation about what investigators should have done. This is how kidnapping cases work. When a family reports contact from someone claiming to hold a missing person, that contact gets evaluated immediately. The communication gets traced. The claim gets assessed against known evidence. Resources get deployed. The question is not whether investigators did the right thing by taking those texts seriously. Of course they did. The question is what that process costs, in time, in attention, in the bandwidth of an investigation that had no margin to spare. Let's stay with that question for a moment before we go further, because it is easy to underestimate. Investigations are not infinite. They are built from finite resources, agents, analysts, communication monitoring systems, laboratory capacity. In the early days of a major case, those resources are stretched across multiple simultaneous priorities. Adding a new thread, even one that gets resolved quickly, is not a neutral event. Think of it this way. If you are building a picture from 1,000 pieces, and someone drops 200 fake pieces into the pile, the picture does not stop being buildable. But you have to take time to identify the fake pieces. You have to determine which parts of the existing picture might have incorporated them. And you have to verify that what remains is accurately sorted. That sorting takes time. And in this case, time was not something the investigation had in abundance. The fact that the FBI resolved the Colella situation within approximately 24 hours is impressive. It reflects serious investigative capability. But 24 hours in the early days of this specific case was not a trivial window. This is what we are going to examine. Not who is guilty of what, but what this specific event, documented, charged, approaching trial, tells us about the challenges that investigations face when the information environment around a case becomes complicated. And the Nancy Guthrie case became complicated very quickly. Before we get into exactly how that complication unfolded, and what behavioral researchers have documented about why people insert themselves into major investigations, make sure you are subscribed to the Last Case Records. This channel exists to go through evidence carefully, factually, and without exaggeration. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss part 2, where the analysis goes deeper. Let's be precise about what the confirmed record tells us, because precision matters here, and the confirmed record is more instructive than it might appear at first reading. On February 4th, 2026, Savannah Guthrie released a video plea publicly appealing for her mother's safe return. That video was widely distributed, broadcast on major networks, shared across social media platforms, reaching a national audience almost immediately. After that video aired, the Guthrie family received text messages. Those messages came from Derek Colella. They made ransom demands, referencing Bitcoin. 2 texts, sent via interstate telecommunications. Federal prosecutors charged Colella under 2 statutes. The first, 18 U.S.C. Section 875A, transmitting a ransom demand in interstate commerce. That statute carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. The second, 47 U.S.C. Section 223, A. 3. Using a telecommunications device to anonymously threaten or harass. That carries a maximum of 2 years. A federal criminal complaint was filed on February 5, 2026, the same day Colella was arrested in Hawthorne, California. He appeared in federal court in Santa Ana on February 6. A judge set bond at $20,000, with conditions including no contact with the Guthrie family and electronic monitoring of his devices. He was transferred to appear in Tucson federal court on February 12, where those conditions were reaffirmed. On March 4, a federal grand jury returned an indictment. Case number 4:26, CR 00459, formally superseding the original complaint. The trial was subsequently scheduled for June 23, 2026, in Tucson federal court. Colella reportedly told investigators he sent the texts to see if the family would respond. That detail has been confirmed in reporting based on official records. That is what the confirmed record shows. Let's now examine what it means analytically. The timing of February 4th is not incidental. It deserves close examination. Savannah Guthrie's public plea aired on February 4th. The texts arrived after the plea. That sequence, public emotional appeal followed almost immediately by contact from a stranger claiming to be the abductor, tells us something specific. The plea was the trigger. This is not speculation. Colella's own confirmed statement, that he sent the texts after seeing or becoming aware of the family's public communication, places the plea as the catalyst. A nationally broadcast video of a daughter begging for her mother's life is an emotionally charged event. It reaches enormous audiences. And for reasons we will examine in the behavioral section of this video, such moments can attract responses that investigations are not designed to absorb. The family did the right thing by making that appeal. Public appeals in missing person cases generate tips. They maintain media attention. They communicate to anyone with information that there is someone desperately waiting. The appeal was necessary and human and correct. But it also opened a communication channel. And that channel received contact that was not what it appeared to be. It is worth spending time on the specific statutes under which Colella was charged, because they reveal something important about how federal law treats this kind of interference. 18 U.S.C. Section 875, does not distinguish between a real ransom demand and a false one. The statute covers any demand, whether or not the sender has any actual ability to fulfill it, and whether or not they are actually holding anyone. The conduct itself, transmitting a ransom demand in interstate commerce, is the offense. And the legislature set a 20-year maximum for that offense. Think about what that sentencing ceiling communicates. Congress looked at the act of sending a false ransom demand into an active investigation and determined that it warranted the same statutory maximum as conduct that might accompany an actual kidnapping conspiracy. That is not an accident of drafting. It reflects a legislative judgment that this kind of interference causes serious harm. Harm to families. Harm to investigations. Harm to the integrity of a process that depends on the quality of information flowing through it. The U.S. Attorney's Office for Arizona, led by Timothy Kershane, handled this case personally and publicly. A DOJ press release announced the charges. That level of institutional attention, applied to a case involving 2 text messages, reflects the same judgment embedded in the statute. This matters more than it might appear. The FBI identified Derek Colella and arrested him within approximately 24 hours of the texts being sent. That is a genuinely impressive piece of investigative work. It reflects the depth of the monitoring infrastructure already deployed around the family's communications. It reflects the FBI's capacity to trace digital communications quickly and effectively. And it reflects the seriousness with which the FBI treated any contact claiming to come from the person holding Nancy Guthrie. But here is what that 24-hour resolution does not tell us. It does not tell us that the texts cost the investigation nothing. It tells us the situation was resolved within 24 hours, which is different. In those 24 hours, investigators were simultaneously tracing the text's origin, determining whether the texts contained any details that could only be known by someone actually connected to the crime, assessing whether the family should engage with the contact, briefing relevant parties on the development, and continuing every other thread of the underlying investigation that did not pause for this new complication. None of that happened for free. It happened because the FBI had the resources and capability to handle it. But it happened alongside everything else, not instead of everything else. The 24-hour resolution is a testament to investigative capability. It is not evidence that the interference was without cost. Here is a detail that has not received enough analytical attention in most coverage. The Colella texts were not the only ransom communications investigators were managing at that time. The confirmed record shows that the Guthrie family had received multiple ransom demands from unknown parties that referenced specific deadlines. February 9th. February 13th. Those demands were considered credible by law enforcement, at least initially. Their origin remains unknown as of the reporting period. They have not been publicly attributed to any identified individual. So on February 4th, when Colella's texts arrived, investigators were not encountering ransom contact for the first time. They were encountering additional ransom contact while already managing existing demands of unknown origin. That creates a specific analytical challenge that is worth naming clearly. When you have multiple streams of ransom communication, some authenticated as false, some of unknown origin, all demanding evaluation, the investigative task is not simply to process each one individually. It is to determine whether they are related, whether the false contact reflects knowledge of the authentic contact, whether there is any overlap in language, demand structure, or technical characteristics that requires explanation. That determination is not a simple database query. It requires comparative analysis across multiple communications, conducted under time pressure, by investigators who are simultaneously managing every other aspect of an active investigation. Colella's texts were identified as a hoax and resolved within 24 hours. Whether any analytical work connecting them to the authentic ransom communications was conducted, and what that work revealed, is not confirmed in the public record. But the question of whether those two streams of ransom contact were ever analyzed in relation to each other is, at minimum, worth raising. The confirmed facts of this case raise several questions that have not been adequately examined in most coverage. These are not rhetorical questions designed to imply answers. They are genuine investigative questions, the kind that analysts and researchers would ask when examining a case of this type. And they are grounded entirely in what the confirmed record shows. Question 1. What did the family's public appeal change about the communication environment? On February 4th, Savannah Guthrie's plea went public. Within hours, the family received Colella's texts. The proximity of those two events is the first question worth examining. Public appeals in missing person cases serve a documented purpose. They generate tips, maintain media attention, and communicate urgency to potential witnesses. They are a standard and often effective investigative tool. But they also change the communication environment around a case. They signal that the family is accessible, emotionally, publicly, through whatever channels reach them. They invite contact. And the nature of that contact is impossible to fully control. The question investigators and researchers who study major cases would likely examine. When a nationally broadcast emotional appeal is made in an active kidnapping case, what does that do to the volume and quality of incoming communications? And how does that change the investigative challenge? In this specific case, the confirmed record shows that over 1,500 tips were received by the time the family announced the $1 million reward on February 24th. That is an enormous volume of information to process. Not all of those tips were equally credible. Not all of them were actionable. The investigative work of sorting that volume, of identifying the signal within the noise, is real and ongoing. The Colella texts represent one data point in that broader challenge. A particularly notable one, because they came with a federal charge attached. But they are part of a larger pattern worth understanding. Question 2. Did the public announcement of Colella's arrest signal anything to the actual perpetrator? This is a question the available record cannot answer. But it is a question worth raising carefully. Colella's arrest was announced publicly on February 5, 2026. The DOJ issued a press release. National media reported it. The story, false ransom texts sent to the Guthrie family, sender identified and arrested within 24 hours, reached the same audiences that were following the underlying case. Whoever actually took Nancy Guthrie was, In all reasonable probability, monitoring the media coverage of this case. Major kidnapping cases involving public figures generate intense media attention, and the people who commit those crimes are often acutely aware of what is being reported about them. What would the Colella arrest announcement communicate to someone in that position? Several things are worth considering. First, that the FBI had the capability to trace ransom-related communications in real time and identify the sender within 24 hours. That is not a small piece of information for someone who has sent their own ransom demands. Second, that the family's communication channels were being actively monitored. The speed of Colella's identification implies a monitoring infrastructure already in place around communications reaching the family. Third, that law enforcement was treating all ransom contact, real or fake, as a federal matter worthy of immediate response. Whether any of this affected the behavior of the actual perpetrator, whether it caused them to modify their communication strategy, go silent, or change any other aspect of their approach, is not confirmed in the available record. It is genuinely unknown. But it is a question that sits at the intersection of the Colella case and the underlying investigation in a way that has not been widely examined. And it deserves more than a footnote. Question 3. What does the stated motivation actually tell us? Colella reportedly told investigators he sent the texts to see if the family would respond. That statement, confirmed in reporting, is the most analytically interesting detail in the entire Colella situation. And it is worth examining carefully. Not because it explains everything, but because it raises a question that the behavioral analysis section of this video will explore more fully. What was Colella expecting to happen? If the family responded, if his texts generated contact, acknowledgement, or engagement, what did he imagine that would mean? What did he imagine would follow? The confirmed record does not answer these questions. His trial, scheduled for June 23rd, may produce testimony or evidence that illuminates his thinking. But based on what is confirmed, the stated motivation, wanting to see if there would be a response, is a detail that points toward a specific documented behavioral pattern. A pattern of individuals who, during high-profile cases, seek some form of participation in events they are watching from the outside. That pattern has been studied, and what researchers have found about it is more instructive, and in some ways more unsettling, than the simple label of hoax might suggest. Let's go there now. We're about to get into the behavioral and psychological analysis section, and this is where the research behind this kind of interference becomes genuinely surprising. If you're watching this on the last case records and you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover cases like this one with the level of detail they deserve, and part 2 of this script goes even deeper. Before we go any further, I want to be precise about what this section is and what it is not. This section discusses documented behavioral patterns observed across many high-profile criminal cases. These patterns come from criminological research, forensic psychology literature, and case studies developed by law enforcement professionals over decades. None of what follows is a psychological diagnosis of Derek Colella specifically. He has not been convicted. His trial has not occurred. His motivations, as understood by the court, will be determined through a legal process, not through a YouTube analysis. What I am doing here is providing documented context for a documented phenomenon. Because what Colella allegedly did, inserting himself into an active kidnapping investigation through false contact, is not unprecedented. It has a history, and that history tells us something worth understanding. High-profile criminal cases, particularly those involving missing persons, kidnappings, and murders with significant media coverage, consistently attract individuals who attempt to insert themselves into the investigation. This happens through false tips, through false confessions, and, as in this case, through false contact with victims' families. This is not a fringe observation. It is a well-documented challenge in case management. Law enforcement agencies that handle major cases build processes specifically to evaluate and filter this kind of interference, because experience has shown it will come. The question researchers have examined is, who engages in this behavior, and why? The answers fall into several documented categories. And I want to be clear, these categories are general frameworks developed across many cases. They are not a description of any individual in this case. Category 1. The attention proximity pattern. One documented pattern involves individuals who are drawn, during major media events, toward proximity to something that feels significant. High-profile criminal cases, particularly those involving recognizable public figures or their families, create an unusual gravitational field in the public consciousness. They dominate news cycles. They generate emotional resonance. They make millions of people feel, in some way, personally connected to events they are watching from a distance. For most people, that connection remains passive. They follow the coverage. They share updates. They hope for a resolution. But for a smaller subset of individuals, the boundary between observer and participant becomes less stable. The desire to be connected to something that feels significant can translate into action, into reaching out, inserting oneself, making contact. The confirmed timing in this case is relevant here. Collella's texts arrived after Savannah Guthrie's public plea. That plea was an emotionally charged national broadcast. It represented one of the most visible, most affecting moments in the case's public arc. Whether that moment served as a trigger, and why it might have, is a question the trial may address. But the pattern of high-profile emotional events attracting this kind of response is documented across many cases. Category 2. The crime spectator dynamic. Forensic researchers have identified and studied what is sometimes described as the crime spectator phenomenon, a pattern of intense, consuming engagement with the details of major criminal cases. For individuals who follow cases at this level of investment, the experience is not passive observation. It is something closer to immersion. They track every development. They analyze every detail. They follow every media report. The case becomes, in some functional sense, a major presence in their daily experience. For most people in this category, the engagement stays internal. It does not produce external action. But in some documented instances, the immersive quality of that engagement produces something else. A narrowing of the psychological distance between the observer and the events being observed. The case begins to feel like something the observer is part of, not in a delusional sense necessarily, but in a way that makes external action feel more accessible than it otherwise would. Sending a text message is not a significant physical act. It requires minimal resources and minimal commitment. For someone already deeply immersed in the details of a case, the threshold for that kind of action may be lower than it would be for someone engaging with the case more casually. Again, this is a documented pattern. It is not a characterization of Colella or anyone else in this case. Category 3. The response-seeking pattern. The most analytically interesting element of the Colella situation, based on the confirmed record, is the stated motivation. He sent the texts to see if the family would respond. Researchers who study deceptive communication and false insertions into criminal cases have documented a pattern sometimes described as response-seeking behavior. The defining characteristic of this pattern is that the individual is not primarily motivated by financial gain, by the desire to mislead investigators, or by any specific outcome related to the crime itself. What they are seeking is confirmation, evidence that their presence in the situation has been registered. A response, any response that closes the loop between their action and the world they are acting toward. In this framework, a reply from the family would not have been primarily valuable as money or information. It would have been valuable as acknowledgement, as evidence that the action produced a real effect in the real world. This pattern has been observed in false confession cases, in cases involving false tips, and in cases where individuals have sent communications to victims' families during active investigations. The pattern does not require the individual to have any connection to the underlying crime. It does not require malicious intent in the traditional sense. What it requires is a specific kind of need, the need to participate in some way in something that feels significant, and the absence of a sufficient psychological barrier to acting on that need. Again, this is a documented behavioral framework. It is not a diagnosis. It is not a verdict. It is a lens through which researchers and investigators have analyzed similar conduct in documented cases across the past several decades. Why high-profile cases are structurally more vulnerable. There is a specific structural reason why cases like Nancy Guthrie's are more likely to attract this kind of interference than lower-profile cases. And it is worth naming directly. The visibility of this case was exceptional. Savannah Guthrie is a nationally recognized broadcaster. Her mother's disappearance was the top story on multiple major networks simultaneously. The family's public communications were watched by millions. The investigation was being discussed in real time across social media platforms with massive reach. That visibility creates conditions that documented research has associated with increased false insertion attempts. Maximum public exposure means maximum audience, including individuals who might engage in this behavior. The family's public plea was an explicit, emotionally charged invitation for contact from anyone with information, which also invites contact from people without information. The publicly known parameters of the case, including the fact that ransom demands had been made, gave potential false contacts a template to work from. Bitcoin had been referenced in the public coverage of the case, and the presence of a publicly recognizable victim, Savannah Guthrie, created an unusual additional dimension. Contacting the family in this case was not just inserting oneself into a kidnapping investigation. It was, in some sense, inserting oneself into the life of someone who appears on national television every morning. That combination of factors, national visibility, public emotional appeal, publicly known case parameters, a recognizable public figure at the center, creates a specific set of conditions that investigators managing major cases have learned to anticipate. The interference that came in this case was not random. It was, in a documented sense, predictable, which does not make it acceptable or harmless, or less worthy of serious prosecution. But it does make it understandable, in the specific sense that behavioral researchers use that word. Not sympathetically, analytically. What investigators look for when false contact occurs. When false ransom demands appear in an active investigation, the process of evaluating and eliminating them is more involved than it might appear from the outside. Documented investigative practice in such situations typically involves several parallel lines of inquiry. First, does the false contact contain any information that was not publicly available? If the texts referenced details about the crime that only the perpetrator, or someone with inside knowledge could know, that would change their significance entirely. The process of determining whether any such details exist requires comparing the contact against the full body of known evidence, including evidence that has not been publicly released. Second, is there any connection between the person who made the false contact and the victim, the family, or the geographic area of the crime? Even a coincidental connection requires documentation and evaluation. Third, does the pattern of false contact, the timing, the method, the content, mirror any aspect of the authentic ransom communications in ways that require explanation? Each of these lines of inquiry requires investigative time and resources, and each of them has to be pursued before the false contact can be definitively filed away as unrelated to the underlying crime. The confirmed record does not tell us exactly how much of this process was conducted in the Colella case before he was identified and arrested. The 24-hour resolution suggests the FBI moved quickly. But quickly in this context does not mean without effort. The federal prosecution, what the charging decision signals. One final element of the behavioral picture is worth examining: the decision to pursue federal prosecution at the highest available charge level. The U.S. Attorney's Office for Arizona did not file a minor complaint. They charged Colella under 18 U.S.C. Section 875A, the statute covering interstate ransom demands, with its 20-year maximum. They announced the charges publicly and promptly. That charging decision reflects an institutional judgment about the seriousness of the conduct. And it is worth understanding what that judgment communicates. Federal prosecutors exercise significant discretion in charging decisions. The choice to charge under the ransom demand statute, rather than a lesser offense, signals that the conduct was viewed as qualitatively serious, not merely inconvenient. The public announcement of the charges signals that prosecutors wanted this outcome to be known, both as a deterrent to others who might consider similar conduct, and as a statement about the investigation's capacity to respond to interference. In behavioral terms, that charging decision is itself a form of communication. It says, "We see this, we take it seriously, and the consequences are real." The trial, scheduled for June 23, 2026, will test that communication in a formal legal setting. Whatever its outcome, The charging decision itself is evidence of how the investigative and prosecutorial apparatus responded to what entered this case on February 4th. Now I want to take what we have established, the confirmed facts, the behavioral context, the investigative questions, and push the analysis one level deeper. Because there are aspects of this situation that most coverage passed over. Details that, when examined carefully, reveal a more complicated picture than the simple hoax resolved. Moving on, framing suggests the information contamination problem. More than a metaphor. Earlier in this video, I used the image of fake puzzle pieces dropped into a pile. Let me be more specific about what that means in practice. Investigations of this type generate documentation. Every communication received by the family gets logged. Every ransom demand gets analyzed and filed. Every piece of incoming information becomes part of a record that investigators reference throughout the life of the case. When false information enters that record, it does not simply disappear after it is identified as false. It remains in the record, clearly marked as unverified or dismissed, but present. And as the investigation progresses, there will be moments when investigators reviewing the case's history encounter it again. In a long-running investigation, and this case has already exceeded 100 days as of the reporting period, the volume of material in the case record grows substantially. Managing that volume, and maintaining clarity about what is confirmed versus what was dismissed, is itself an ongoing task. The Colella texts are a small piece of that record. But they are a piece. And they entered it at a moment when the record was being built most rapidly, and most consequentially. The public perception problem. Two stories running simultaneously. On February 5, 2026, two significant announcements were made in connection with the Nancy Guthrie case. The first, the Pima County Sheriff confirmed that Nancy Guthrie's blood had been found at her home. DNA testing had matched the blood to her. This was a major development in the underlying investigation. Confirmation of physical evidence of foul play. The second, the DOJ announced that Derek Colella had been arrested and charged in connection with false ransom demands. Both stories ran on February 5th. Both received national coverage. For careful followers of the case, the distinction was clear. One story was about the investigation, one story was about a separate federal charge. But media coverage of major cases does not always reach audiences in clear, organized form. For casual followers, people absorbing headlines rather than full reports, the presence of an arrest story may have created an impression of investigative progress that did not fully reflect reality. This is not a criticism of media coverage. It is an observation about how information travels in high-attention cases, and what happens when multiple simultaneous stories compete for the same cognitive space. The confirmed record also gives us a later example of exactly this phenomenon. On April 16, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Office posted on social media that Nancy has been located. That post referred to a completely different missing person, an unrelated case involving someone else named Nancy. But the post reached people who were following the Guthrie case. And the confusion it generated required a public correction. On April 17th, following viral claims that a person of interest had been detained, Sheriff Nanos responded on social media with a single word: nope. These are not minor administrative glitches. They are data points in a pattern. The information environment around this case has been consistently complicated. By misinformation, by ambiguous posts, by the presence of a high-profile federal charge that runs parallel to but separate from the underlying investigation. The Colella situation was the first major instance of that complication. It was not the last. The surveillance signal. A detail worth examining. Here is a detail that deserves more attention than it has received. The FBI identified and arrested Colella within approximately 24 hours of the texts being sent. That speed implies a monitoring infrastructure already in place around the family's communications. The ability to trace incoming contacts in near real time. Now consider what the public announcement of that arrest communicated to the broader world. Anyone following this case, including, in all reasonable probability, whoever actually took Nancy Guthrie, now knew something specific. The FBI was actively monitoring all communications reaching the family, and could identify and act on those communications within a single day. The authentic ransom demands, of unknown origin, had already been received before the Colella arrest. Their deadlines of February 9th and February 13th were already set, at least as far as the public record shows. Whether those deadlines passed without further communication, whether the authentic demands continued or ceased after the Colella arrest became public, is not confirmed in the available record. But the question of whether the public announcement of the FBI's surveillance capability changed anything about the communication landscape after February 5th is a genuinely interesting investigative question. And it is one that the available public record does not fully answer. The expectation gap. Visible resolution versus ongoing silence. There is a final implication of the Colella situation that I want to name directly. The speed and visibility of Colella's arrest, announced publicly, covered nationally, resolved with federal charges within 24 hours, created a visible marker of investigative success in a case that had not yet produced visible markers of investigative success in its underlying investigation. An arrest was made. Charges were filed. A trial date was set. For a public following a case where the main investigation had not yet produced an arrest, those visible outcomes carried weight. They communicated that the investigative apparatus was functioning, that law enforcement was responding. But the visible success in the Colella case, the federal charge, the arrest, the trial date, exists in tension with the ongoing silence in the underlying investigation. No suspect has been identified publicly. No arrest has been made. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 100 days. The gap between those two realities, swift visible resolution of a peripheral matter, ongoing absence of resolution in the central matter, is not a contradiction. It reflects the fundamental difference between tracing a text message and identifying an unknown individual who took deliberate steps to avoid identification. But it is worth naming because that gap is part of the information environment that shapes how the public, the media, and ultimately potential witnesses understand and engage with this case. Visible resolution of the Colella case may, in some measure, have satisfied a public appetite for investigative progress in a way that did not correspond to actual progress in finding Nancy Guthrie. That is not anyone's fault. It is a structural reality of how major cases are perceived and reported. But it is worth understanding. I have spent the first half of this video building an analytical argument. The argument is this: when false ransom demands entered an active kidnapping investigation on day 3, the cost to that investigation, even if quickly resolved, was more than negligible and deserves serious examination. But analysis worth trusting acknowledges its own limits. And every argument worth making has reasonable counterpoints. So before we go any further, I want to present those counterpoints clearly. Not as strawman versions designed to be knocked down, but as genuinely reasonable alternative interpretations of the same evidence we have been examining. Because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging when the available record supports more than one reading. And the Colella situation, precisely because it was resolved quickly and charged federally, can be read in ways that do not align with the complications framework I have built. Let's walk through them. Counterpoint 1. The rapid resolution may have actually clarified the investigation. Here is a reasonable alternative reading of the Colella situation. When the texts arrived on February 4th, investigators had to treat them as potentially authentic. They deployed resources to trace them. And within 24 hours, they conclusively identified the source, determined that the source had no connection to the underlying crime, and eliminated that thread entirely. That elimination was not a cost. It was clarification. Before the texts were traced, investigators had multiple streams of ransom contact to evaluate. Some authentic, some of unknown origin. After Colella was identified and arrested, one of those streams was definitively resolved. The investigative picture became simpler, not more complicated. In this reading, the 24 hours spent identifying Colella were not wasted hours. They were hours that produced a verified negative evidence that these specific texts could be disregarded, which is itself a form of investigative progress. Moreover, the public announcement of Colella's arrest communicated something important to the broader world. Law enforcement was actively filtering false contact, and doing so quickly and effectively. That announcement may have deterred others who were considering similar interference. It may have strengthened public confidence in the investigation's capacity to separate signal from noise. And finally, The swift resolution demonstrated investigative competence at a moment when public confidence in the investigation mattered. It showed that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office were functioning, responding, and holding accountable anyone who interfered with the process. In this framework, the Colella situation, far from being a costly distraction, was a demonstration of investigative strength that clarified the case and strengthened its management going forward. That is not a weak argument. It is grounded in the same confirmed facts I have been analyzing throughout this video. And it deserves to be taken seriously. Counterpoint 2. The 24-hour resolution demonstrates investigative capability, not distraction. A second reasonable counterpoint focuses on what the speed of Colella's identification actually tells us about the investigation's operational capacity. The FBI did not spend days or weeks chasing the Colella texts. They identified the source and made an arrest in approximately 24 hours. That timeline reflects an investigative infrastructure that was already functioning at a high level, monitoring communications, tracing digital contacts, coordinating across jurisdictions between California and Arizona. In this reading, the Colella situation is not evidence that the investigation was vulnerable to distraction. It is evidence that the investigation was sufficiently resourced and competent to handle complications quickly without losing momentum on other fronts. The fact that an arrest was made does not mean the rest of the investigation paused. Major investigations are managed by teams. Multiple agents, multiple analysts, multiple lines of inquiry running in parallel. The resources deployed to identify Colella were likely a subset of the overall investigative capacity, not the entirety of it. In this framework, the 24-hour resolution is not a sign of cost. It is a sign of effective case management under difficult circumstances. And the federal prosecution that followed, charging Colella under statutes that carry serious penalties, was not an overreaction. It was an appropriate response to conduct that the law explicitly prohibits and that could have caused harm if handled less effectively. This is a credible interpretation, and it is supported by the confirmed record just as clearly as the complications framework I have been building. Counterpoint 3. The Colella situation may have generated useful investigative byproducts. Here is a third alternative interpretation that is worth serious consideration. When investigators built the infrastructure to monitor all communications reaching the Guthrie family, the infrastructure that allowed them to trace Colella's texts within 24 hours, they were not building it solely to catch hoaxers. They were building it to capture everything. Every communication. Every contact. Every potential lead. That monitoring infrastructure operates continuously. It does not turn off when a false contact is identified. It keeps running, capturing data, building a record of every incoming communication and every outgoing response. In this reading, the process of tracing Colella's texts was not isolated from the broader investigation. It was part of the same monitoring system that was simultaneously capturing and analyzing all other communications in the case, including the authentic ransom demands of unknown origin. It is entirely possible, and this cannot be confirmed from the public record, but it is analytically reasonable, that the technical process of tracing Colella produced investigative byproducts that were useful to the broader case. Digital forensic traces. Metadata. Patterns in how communications were being routed to the family. In high-level digital investigations, the act of tracing one communication often produces insights about the broader communication environment. The tools deployed, the databases queried, the technical methodologies applied, all of those can generate findings that extend beyond the single communication being traced. If that happened in this case, if the process of identifying Colella also produced intelligence relevant to the authentic ransom demands or to other aspects of the investigation, then the 24 hours spent on the Colella situation were not a distraction at all. They were investigative time that served multiple purposes simultaneously. This interpretation is speculative in the sense that it cannot be confirmed from the public record. But it is not baseless speculation. It is grounded in how digital forensic investigations actually work at the federal level. And it is a reminder that what looks like a distraction from the outside may, from the inside, have served investigative purposes that are not immediately visible. Counterpoint 4. The public's ability to distinguish between the cases was not as limited as this video has suggested. A fourth counterpoint concerns public perception. I have argued that the Colella arrest, announced publicly on February 5th, the same day as the blood evidence confirmation, may have created confusion in the public information environment. That some casual followers of the case may have absorbed the arrest story as evidence of progress in the underlying investigation, when in fact it was a separate matter. But that argument assumes a level of public confusion that may not have actually occurred. Most major media outlets reported the Colella arrest clearly and accurately. They identified it as a separate federal charge. They distinguished it from the underlying investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the DOJ were all clear in their public communications that Colella was not charged with any involvement in the abduction itself. For anyone following the case with even moderate attention, the distinction was available and clear. The argument that the public was meaningfully confused depends on assuming that most people following the case were absorbing only headlines, not full stories. That may be true for some portion of the audience, but it is not necessarily true for the people who mattered most. Potential witnesses with real information, serious tip providers, and individuals close enough to the case to contribute meaningfully to the investigation. In this reading, the public information environment was not as contaminated as I have suggested. The distinction between the Colella case and the underlying investigation was clear enough, communicated often enough, and reinforced consistently enough that the risk of meaningful confusion was minimal. That is a fair counterpoint, and it is grounded in the reality that media coverage, for all its faults, was largely accurate in distinguishing the two cases. Honest acknowledgement of what this analysis can and cannot claim. Let me be direct about the limits of what this video has argued. I have examined whether the Colella hoax complicated the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. I have built a case that it did, that even a quickly resolved distraction has costs in terms of time, resources, and the clarity of the information environment. But the honest answer to the central question is this: we cannot know with certainty. The investigative process that managed the Colella situation is not fully visible in the public record. The internal prioritization decisions, the resource allocation, the extent to which the Colella thread ran parallel to other work versus competed with it. None of that is confirmed in ways that allow definitive conclusions. What we can say is that false information entering an active investigation at a critical moment is documented, across many cases, to have costs. The questions those costs raise, about how investigations manage noise, about what public appeals invite, about how quickly false threads can be identified and eliminated, are worth examining. But whether the specific costs in this specific case rose to the level of materially affecting the outcome of the investigation is a question that may only be answerable in hindsight, when the investigation concludes and its full timeline can be examined. I have built this video around a framework that treats the Colella situation as a complication. But the counterpoints I have just presented, that it clarified the investigation, that it demonstrated capability, that it may have generated useful byproducts, and that the public largely understood the distinction, are all grounded in the same evidence. Both readings are reasonable, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that. Now let's turn to where both cases stand today, and what remains unanswered. As of the time this video is being recorded, two parallel cases are moving forward. One is complete in its evidentiary phase and awaiting trial. The other is ongoing, active, and unresolved. Let's be precise about where each one stands. The federal case against Derek Colella. Status as of now. Derek Colella is scheduled to stand trial in United States District Court for the District of Arizona Tucson Division on June 23, 2026. He is charged under two federal statutes, 18 U.S.C. Section 875A, for transmitting a ransom demand in interstate commerce, which carries a maximum penalty of 20 years, and 47 U.S.C. Section 223A, 3, for using a telecommunications device to threaten or harass, which carries a maximum penalty of 2 years. He was arrested on February 5, 2026, and has been released on a $20,000 bond. The conditions of his release include no contact with the Guthrie family and electronic monitoring of his devices. He has complied with those conditions and remains out of custody as of the reporting period. A federal grand jury returned an indictment on March 4, 2026, formally superseding the original criminal complaint. That indictment, case number 4:26, CR 00459, is the charging document under which the trial will proceed. No plea has been announced. No plea negotiations have been publicly reported. The case is proceeding toward trial. What the trial will likely involve: testimony from investigators about how the texts were traced and identified, evidence about the content of the texts and their timing relative to Savannah Guthrie's public plea, expert testimony, potentially, about the technical methods used to trace digital communications, and Collella's own statements to investigators, including his reported explanation that he sent the texts to see if the family would respond. The trial will also involve legal questions about intent. The statute under which Colella is charged, 18 U.S.C. Section 875A, requires proof that the defendant transmitted a ransom demand. But the extent to which the government must prove traditional extortionate intent versus simply proving that a demand was made is a legal question that may be contested at trial. Colella is represented by counsel. He is presumed innocent. The outcome of the trial is unknown. But the trial itself, scheduled for late June 2026, may produce evidence, testimony, and findings that shed additional light on the questions this video has been examining. What Collella's actual motivations were. What he expected to happen. Whether his conduct reflected any awareness of the authentic ransom demands or any other details of the case beyond what was publicly available. Those questions will be answered, or not answered, in a courtroom. Not in analysis videos like this one. The underlying investigation. Status as of now. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since the night of January 31, 2026. She was last seen when her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, dropped her off at her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson around 9:50 p.m. that evening. She was reported missing on February 1st, after she failed to appear at her morning church service. As of the reporting period in late April 2026, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 100 days. No arrest has been made in connection with her disappearance. The investigation is being led by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, with assistance from the FBI. The FBI has offered a reward that has been increased to $100,000 for information leading to Nancy's location or the identification of those responsible for her disappearance. Savannah Guthrie and her family announced an additional $1 million reward on February 24, 2026. The combined reward, $1.1 million, remains active. The confirmed evidence in the case includes blood evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's porch, confirmed by DNA testing to belong to her, announced publicly on February 5, 2026. Doorbell camera footage showing a masked, armed individual at Nancy's home, released by the FBI on February 10, 2026. The individual is described as a male, approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches, wearing dark clothing and carrying a black Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack. Personal items belonging to Nancy, including her glasses, phone, and bank cards, found undisturbed at her home, suggesting she did not leave willingly. Multiple ransom demands received by the family, of unknown origin, referencing specific deadlines and demanding cryptocurrency. Over 1,500 tips received by investigators as of late February 2026, when the family announced the $1 million reward. The FBI has also released images of the backpack carried by the suspect, asking the public to help identify it or anyone who may have purchased or owned a similar item. Despite this substantial body of evidence, no suspect has been publicly identified. No arrest has been announced. And Nancy Guthrie's whereabouts remain unknown. On February 24, 2026, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos publicly stated that all Guthrie siblings and their spouses had been cleared as possible suspects. That public clearance has been reinforced in subsequent statements and is consistent with investigative findings as understood from official sources. The investigation remains active. The FBI continues to accept tips through its online portal and through the National Tip Line. 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Sheriff's Office continues to process incoming information and follow investigative leads. But as of now, the central question, where is Nancy Guthrie, and who is responsible for her disappearance, has not been answered. The unanswered questions in the Colella case. The Colella trial, scheduled for June 23rd, may answer some questions. But even if it proceeds as scheduled and produces a verdict, there are questions it will not answer. First, Was Colella aware of the authentic ransom demands that had already been received by the family before he sent his texts? The confirmed record does not tell us whether he had knowledge of those demands, or whether his texts coincidentally mirrored the demand structure already present in the case. If he was aware, if he had followed media coverage closely enough to know that ransom demands involving Bitcoin had already been made, that would provide context for why his hoax took the specific form it did. If he was not aware, and the similarity was coincidental, that tells us something different about his level of engagement with the case. The trial may address this, or it may not. It depends on what evidence the government introduces and what Colella's defense presents. Second, did Colella attempt to send any other communications, before or after the 2 texts that led to his arrest, that were not identified or charged? The confirmed record shows 2 texts. But digital forensic investigations often uncover patterns of behavior beyond the specific acts charged. Whether Colella engaged in any other contact attempts, or any other forms of engagement with the case, is unknown from the public record. Third, what specifically did Colella expect would happen if the family responded? His stated motivation was to see if they would respond. But what did he imagine the content of that response would be? What did he imagine he would do with it? These are questions about intent and state of mind. They may be explored at trial through his own testimony, if he chooses to testify, or through expert analysis of his conduct and statements. But they may also remain unanswered, because criminal trials do not always produce clarity about the subjective motivations of defendants. They produce verdicts about whether specific statutory elements have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The unanswered questions in the underlying investigation. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance carries far more significant unanswered questions. The ransom demands of unknown origin, those that were considered authentic, or at least credible enough to warrant serious investigation, remain unresolved. Who sent them? Were they from the person who took Nancy Guthrie, or from additional parties seeking to exploit the situation? Did the deadlines referenced in those demands, February 9th and February 13th, pass without further contact, or did communication continue beyond those dates in ways that have not been publicly reported? The doorbell camera footage has been released, and the FBI has provided a physical description of the suspect. But no identification has been made public. Whether investigators have identified a suspect internally and are building a case, or whether the suspect remains genuinely unknown, is not confirmed in the available record. The blood evidence confirmed foul play, but it did not, by itself, tell investigators where Nancy was taken or by whom. Whether additional forensic evidence was recovered from the scene, fingerprints, DNA, digital traces, and what that evidence has revealed is not part of the public record. And the most fundamental question, is Nancy Guthrie alive? Sheriff Nano stated publicly on February 5th that there was no evidence she was alive, but that investigators hoped she was. That statement reflected the evidence available at that time. Whether any evidence has emerged since then that changes that assessment is unknown. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has medical needs that require daily medication. The longer she remains missing, the more urgent the question of her condition becomes. And that urgency is not diminished by the passage of time. It is intensified. The questions in this case are not going away. They are getting sharper. And if you want to stay updated as new developments emerge, if you want analysis that treats these cases with the care and precision they deserve, subscribe to the Last Case Records. Because we will continue covering this case as it unfolds, and we will do it without exaggeration, without speculation presented as fact, and without losing sight of what matters most. I want to be explicit about the limits of what this video has examined. This video has focused on a single analytical angle, whether the false ransom demands sent by Derek Colella complicated the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, and what that complication, if it existed, might tell us about the broader challenges of managing high-profile kidnapping cases in a saturated media environment. That angle is narrow by design. It does not attempt to answer the larger questions in this case. And it is important to name clearly what those larger questions are, and why this video has not tried to answer them. Question 1. Who took Nancy Guthrie? This video has not examined suspects, theories, or investigative leads related to the actual abduction. That is the subject of an ongoing law enforcement investigation. It is not the subject of YouTube analysis. The confirmed evidence, blood at the scene, doorbell footage, ransom demands, points toward an abduction. But the identity of the person or persons responsible is not confirmed in the public record. And speculating about suspects without evidence is not analysis. It is interference. There are other videos on other channels that engage in that kind of speculation. This is not one of them. Question 2. Does Colella have any connection to the actual crime? The confirmed record contains no evidence of any connection between Derek Colella and the underlying crime. He has not been charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, or any offense related to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Investigators identified him, traced his communications, and determined, quickly, that his involvement was limited to the false texts. Whether any deeper connection exists, unknown to the public, is not something this video can assess. The available evidence does not support such a connection. And absent evidence, raising the possibility is not responsible analysis. Question 3. Will the Colella trial reveal anything useful to the underlying investigation? This is genuinely unknown. It is possible that testimony or evidence introduced at trial will shed light on aspects of the case beyond Colella's specific conduct. It is possible that the trial will produce findings that investigators can use in the broader investigation. It is also possible that the trial will be narrowly focused on the statutory elements of the charges against Colella, and will not produce anything of investigative value beyond confirming what is already known. We will not know until the trial occurs. And even then, we may not know because investigative value is not always publicly visible. Question 4. Did the hoax materially delay or damage the investigation? This is the central question this video has been built around. And the honest answer is, we do not know. I have built a framework that suggests it did. I have examined the timing, the resources required, the information environment, and the documented costs of false information in major cases. I have presented counterpoints that suggest it did not, or that any costs were minimal and quickly mitigated. Both frameworks are grounded in the available evidence. Both are analytically reasonable. The question of whether the Colella hoax materially affected the outcome of the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is one that may only be answerable in retrospect. When the investigation concludes, when its full timeline is known, and when investigators can speak more freely about how different threads were managed and prioritized. Until then, what we have is the confirmed record, the documented behavioral patterns, and the questions those patterns raise. This video has examined those questions as carefully as the available evidence allows. But it has not, and cannot, answer them definitively. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 100 days. She is 84 years old. She has a family that loves her. A daughter who stepped away from one of the most visible roles in American journalism to focus on finding her. Siblings who have cooperated fully with investigators. A community that has responded with tips, attention, and sustained public concern. The case has generated national media coverage. It has drawn the involvement of the FBI. It has produced a substantial body of physical evidence. Blood, video footage, forensic traces. It has generated over 1,500 tips. It has prompted a combined reward of $1.1 million. And it has also attracted interference. False ransom demands from a stranger in California. Viral misinformation on social media. Accidental posts from official accounts that had to be corrected. A constantly churning information environment that has, at various points, made it harder to see the case clearly. The Derek Colella situation is one data point in that larger pattern. A documented, charged, prosecuted instance of someone inserting themselves into an active investigation in a way that, whatever its ultimate cost, was serious enough to warrant federal charges carrying a 20-year maximum penalty. That tells us something. It tells us that the space around major investigations is not neutral. It is contested. It attracts attention, speculation, interference, and noise. And managing that space. Separating signal from noise, authentic leads from false ones, helpful public engagement from damaging interference, is part of the investigative work that has to happen alongside everything else. The question this video has examined is whether that work, in this case, came at a cost that deserves more attention than it has received. I believe it does. But I have also presented the counterpoints, because honest analysis requires acknowledging when reasonable people can read the same evidence differently. What cannot be disputed is this: Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The investigation is still active. And the central questions, where she is, who is responsible, and whether she can still be found, remain unanswered. What the Colella case reveals about investigations more broadly. There is a broader lesson in the Colella situation that extends beyond this specific case. High-profile criminal investigations operate in an environment that is fundamentally different from investigations that do not attract sustained media attention. The visibility that helps generate tips also generates noise. The public appeals that invite witnesses also invite interference. The emotional resonance that keeps a case in the public consciousness also attracts individuals whose relationship to the case is not what it appears. Law enforcement agencies that manage major cases understand this. They build processes to filter false information. They deploy resources to trace and eliminate hoaxes. They communicate publicly in ways designed to manage expectations and clarify what is known versus what is speculation. But those processes are not cost-free. They require time, personnel, and investigative bandwidth. And in cases where every hour matters, where physical evidence degrades, where witnesses' memories fade, where digital traces have limited retention windows, the cost of managing interference is not abstract. It is real. The Colella case is a documented example of that cost. It was managed effectively. It was resolved quickly. It resulted in federal charges that send a clear message about the consequences of interfering with an active investigation. But it still happened. And it still required a response. And that response happened during a window of time when the investigation could not afford distractions. Whether that cost rose to the level of materially affecting the investigation's outcome is, as I have said repeatedly, unknown. But the fact that the cost existed, that it was real, measurable, and documented, is not in dispute. And understanding that cost is part of understanding how major investigations actually work, in practice, under real-world conditions. What happens next? Derek Colella's trial is scheduled for June 23, 2026. When it occurs, it will produce testimony, evidence, and potentially a verdict. What that trial reveals, about Colella's motivations, about the technical methods used to identify him, about the broader context of his actions, may add clarity to some of the questions this video has raised. Or it may not. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continues. Tips are still being accepted. Evidence is still being processed. Investigators are still working. The FBI's tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI, remains active. The online portal at tips.fbi.gov remains open. The $1.1 million reward remains available. Someone, somewhere knows something. That is almost always true in cases like this. The question is whether that person will come forward, and whether the information they have will be the piece that changes the picture. Public attention matters in cases like this. Not because public attention solves crimes. Investigators solve crimes. But because public attention keeps the case visible, keeps potential witnesses thinking about it, and keeps the pressure on for answers. That attention is not without cost, as this case has shown. It invites noise alongside signal. But it also invites the tips, the leads, and the witnesses that investigations depend on. The challenge is managing that tension. And the Colella situation is a case study in what happens when the tension is not perfectly managed. When something enters the case from the outside, and investigators have to respond in real time, under pressure, with incomplete information. They did respond. Quickly and effectively. But the fact that they had to respond at all is worth understanding. The human center that cannot be lost. I want to close by returning to what this case is actually about. It is not about federal prosecutions, or media analysis, or the mechanics of digital forensic tracing. It is about an 84-year-old woman who has been missing for more than 100 days. A woman who has a name, a family, a life that was interrupted violently on the night of January 31, 2026. Nancy Guthrie did not ask for any of this. She did not ask to become the subject of a national news story. She did not ask for her daughter to have to plead for her life on television. She did not ask for strangers to send false ransom demands, or for online conspiracy theorists to speculate about her family, or for any of the noise that has surrounded her disappearance. What happened to her happened because someone made a choice. Someone entered her home. Someone took her. And that person, or those people, made additional choices in the days and weeks that followed. The investigation into those choices is ongoing. And every complication that has entered the case since February 1st, including the Colella situation, has made the investigators' job harder, not easier. That is worth remembering, because it is easy in the analysis of major cases to lose sight of the human being at the center, to become focused on the mechanics, the timeline, the evidence, the legal proceedings. But Nancy Guthrie is not a case. She is a person. And she has been missing for more than 100 days. Her family is still waiting. The investigation is still active. And the questions are still unanswered. If this video has given you a deeper understanding of what happened when false information entered this case, if it has helped you see the layers underneath the headlines, then share it. Share it with someone who is following the Nancy Guthrie case. Share it with someone who cares about how investigations actually work. Because every view, every share, every subscription to the last case records keeps cases like this one visible. And visibility matters. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The website is tips.fbi.gov. The reward is $1.1 million. If you have information, any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, that is where it needs to go. This channel exists to examine evidence carefully, factually, and without flinching. If that is the kind of true crime analysis you want to see more of, subscribe now. Because there is more to this case, and we will continue covering it as new developments emerge. Someone knows something. They always do.